Lola Luna Chomnales was born on November 4, 1999, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She grew up in the family of Adriana Belmonte and Diego Chomnales, the son of the renowned chef Beatriz Chomnales. In November 2014, when the girl turned 15, her parents decided to gift her a trip to New York for the Christmas holidays. However, before that, they sent their daughter to spend a few days relaxing with her godmother's family in Rocha, Uruguay. On December 27th, Lola arrived in Uruguay, where she was greeted by her godmother, Claudia Fernandez. The girl was clearly in a great mood, which was captured in a photo taken by Claudia. Claudia, her husband Hernan Tuzinkiewicz, and their 2 children were happy about Lola's arrival. They had planned to spend these few days together, sunbathing on Barra de Velizes beach, swimming in the sea, and relaxing. That same evening, Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson visited a drum festival taking place in the city center. Hernan and the boy didn't leave Lola's side in the crowd, but at some point, the boy moved away from them because he was bored. Nevertheless, after the festival, they all returned home together. The next day, the family went to the beach. Around 3 p.m., Lola asked her godmother for permission to take a walk along the beach. She wanted to walk to the spa resort of Aguas Dulces along a fairly popular trail that allowed her to explore the flora and fauna of the area. Since the route was considered popular and safe for walks, and the locals were known for their friendliness, Claudia had no objections. She told Lola what time they would be waiting for her at home and watched as she calmly walked away from them along the beach. Lola was wearing a bikini and denim shorts. She carried a backpack containing a sarong, a book, her identification, a water bottle, and a towel. She didn't have her phone with her. Obviously, there was poor reception on the beach. The backpack also contained a wallet with 2,000 Uruguayan pesos. Several hours passed, it got dark, and Lola still hadn't returned. Her godmother became worried. The family walked along the route that Lola had planned to take, but she was nowhere to be found. In the evening, Claudia called Lola's parents to explain what had happened. She told Adriana that she had already contacted the police. However, it took another 45 minutes before they arrived at the station and reported the teenager's disappearance. The police began the search for Lola. Since she disappeared during a walk on the beach, it was thoroughly searched both lengthwise and crosswise. Helicopters and search dogs were brought in to assist in the search. Lola's parents immediately arrived in Uruguay to help the police. Almost simultaneously with the start of the investigation, it became known that Adriana and Diego were receiving anonymous calls. The caller did not ask for a ransom or make any demands. They simply stated that Lola was with them and that she was fine. Unfortunately, this turned out to be untrue. 2 days later, on December 30th, her body was found partially covered in sand on the beach. She was in an area with many dunes and dense vegetation. There were shallow knife cuts on her neck and signs of blows on her head. The autopsy revealed that Lola was attacked from behind, then dragged or forced to the location where she was found. The killer pressed her face into the sand for a prolonged period until she suffocated. This was determined by the presence of sand in her lungs. After the news of the crime became known, there was an unprecedented uproar in the press of Argentina and Uruguay. As often happens in such cases, journalists began to put forward theories about what could have happened. The suspicions of the Uruguayan police and the media immediately fell on the family of Lola's godmother, especially on Hernan, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, they claimed to Adriana and Diego that they had already contacted the police, although they actually delayed before going to the station. Secondly, the media tried to see something sinister in the fact that Lola, Hernan, and his 14-year-old stepson went to a drum festival together, but at some point, the boys separated from them, leaving the girl with Hernan. A hypothesis related to violence against Lola emerged, but the forensic expert found no evidence to support this. However, there were other reasons to suspect them. Claudia and Hernan immediately hired a lawyer, and not a single family member agreed to take a polygraph test. Lola's parents added fuel to the fire by making a series of bold statements. In particular, Diego stated that he had long ceased to trust Hernan, which provoked further questions. If he didn't trust the man, why did he allow his daughter to go on vacation with them? It is important to note that Claudia and Adriana had been friends for 25 years. Hernan was Claudia's second husband, and Lola's parents had known him for about 5 years. They all originally lived in Argentina, but Hernan and Claudia moved to Uruguay. When Hernan was interrogated, the investigators noted contradictory statements, which led to his arrest on December 31st. Claudia was arrested on suspicion of concealing evidence. Her son was also detained because he was suspected of making those anonymous calls. It is not confirmed with certainty that he was the one who called Adriana and Diego, but it is evident that those calls were a failed attempt at a joke. Nevertheless, the police interrogated all 3 family members for several days, but there was no evidence against them. The investigators explained that they found some discrepancies in their testimonies, but they were insignificant. Hernan claimed they returned home at 11 o'clock, while his son said it was 12. Besides that, the police had nothing to charge Hernan, Claudia, or her son with. Therefore, on January 2, 2015, they were all released. Apparently, after various public statements, the relationship between the friends suffered. Claudia and her loved ones never spoke to Lola's parents again, nor did they pick up the phone to offer condolences. Adriana believes that their lawyer may have given them such advice. However, she believes that as friends, a simple human gesture would have been to call and express condolences, especially considering their 25 years of friendship. A few days after the discovery of the body, Lola's pink backpack was found. It was also buried in the sand about 200 meters from where Lola's body was found. This immediately raised a lot of questions. How did the police initially not find the body and now the backpack, despite thoroughly searching the entire beach and its surroundings multiple times? Additionally, the authorities in the town had claimed from the beginning that the beach was a very safe area. But it was at least strange because drug dealers operated there, especially in the area where the body was found. Nonetheless, almost all of the girl's belongings remained in the backpack, except for 2,000 pesos that the perpetrator took from her wallet. Furthermore, the towel and documents had bloodstains on them. Forensic experts examined these items and found Lola's DNA on them, but it was mixed with male DNA. Since suspicions had not been completely lifted from Hernan, his DNA was compared to the one found. They checked it against the Uruguayan police database, but there were no matches there either. After the discovery of the backpack, one suspect caused a big stir. He was suspected based on witness testimonies regarding his whereabouts on the day of the murder. According to local residents, a man nicknamed El Conejo, the rabbit, was working on a roof near the beach at the time the girl went for a walk. In the middle of the day, the man went for lunch, and his colleagues knew that he didn't have any money with him. However, he returned with food and cash. This immediately raised the question of where he got the food if he didn't buy it. But that's not all. Someone even claimed to have seen him with a pink backpack on the day of Lola's disappearance. One newspaper wrote that he confessed to the murder, and other media outlets picked up the news. However, it turned out to be untrue. The man provided an explanation of where he got the food. Although the police suspected that he had actually stolen it from beachgoers, there was no evidence connecting him to Lola's case. He never confessed to anything, and after his release, he filed a lawsuit against the newspapers that spread unverified news. At this point, the investigation significantly stalled. The main suspects had already been released, and the investigators had no leads to pursue. At first glance, it seemed that the girl didn't know anyone in the town, but she had managed to attend a drum festival in the city center, and being sociable and open, she freely interacted with people. Therefore, the police had to investigate this lead. They detained and interrogated about 40 people, mainly vendors and dealers from the beach, but they were all eventually released. The situation was further aggravated by the constant changes in prosecutors and judges, and whenever a new prosecutor was appointed, they would review the case from scratch. This significantly hindered the investigation. But on February 18, 2015, there seemed to be some progress in the case. An anonymous call was made to the police. The caller stated that Angel Moreira, also known as El Cachila or Keisha, was involved in the crime. The police arrested and interrogated the man. He worked on the beach, parking cars. Angel explained that he met Lola when she was walking along the beach. He approached her to offer some souvenir trinkets for sale. They exchanged a few sentences about where the girl came from when Lola mentioned feeling dizzy. Angel suggested that they go to a shady area. He took her to a place where tall bushes and dunes provided some shade and coolness. There, the girl fell to her knees. Angel tried to check her pulse, but not hearing it, he got scared and ran away. The statement sounded extremely strange, but without evidence, the police had to release him. 4 years passed when the new prosecutor in Jorge Bay's case reviewed the materials and decided to interrogate Angel again. After the interrogation on May 22, 2019, the man was arrested. This time he was charged with obstruction of justice. His DNA did not match the DNA on Lola's towel and documents, so the prosecutor concluded that he was covering up the person who was truly guilty of the crime. Bass explained that in Angel's statements made in 2015, he revealed details that only someone who was with Lola at the time of the murder could have known. He knew that Lola fell to her knees on the sand, and a forensic expert confirmed this. However, Lola didn't fall because she suddenly felt dizzy, but because she had received shallow knife wounds. Despite Angel's arrest, the Chommiles family still awaited an answer to the main question for several more years. Until geneticist Natalia Sandberg became interested in the case, 7 years after the murder, the case took a decisive turn. And how the investigators found the suspect resembles a plot from a detective novel. It occurred to Natalia Sandberg to trace the genetic DNA trace of an unknown man found on Lola's towel and documents. There were no matches on the paternal line, but the examination of the maternal line revealed a small match with a prisoner serving time for murder. In other words, the man who left his blood on Lola's towel is related to the man currently serving a sentence. The third crime, in which the victims were Marines who died in the naval complex on Cerro de Montevideo, was the tip of the iceberg that allowed investigators to reach the true killer of Lola Chommiles. The murders took place on Sunday morning, May 31, 2020. Juan Manuel Escobar, Alex Galinia, and Alan Rodriguez were found shot in the head. The police established that the killer is Jonathan Brand Gundy. Jonathan was born in Rocha. When the police found his mother and examined her DNA, it became clear that they were looking for another son of the woman, Jonathan's half-brother. The woman told the investigators that she had given birth to 11 children from different fathers, including 8 boys. But only one son was given up for adoption when he was 18 days old. It turned out that he was the one the police had been searching for 7 years. Their new suspect was named Leonardo Senar. In 2014, during Lola's murder, Senar was homeless, spending his days and nights between La Paloma, Chuy, and Castillos. He lived in these places through odd jobs. But recently, he settled in the city of Chuy, lived with a girlfriend, and worked in a bakery. The man had a history of police records from 2003 to 2009 for aggression, theft, and violence. Despite his run-ins with the law, his DNA was not stored in the database because the database itself was created after 2012. Therefore, on May 18, 2022, the police obtained a search warrant for his house. They anticipated that the man would refuse to provide his DNA, and they were right. However, forensic experts examined the man's toothbrush and comb. To the surprise and joy of the forensic experts, The DNA match was 99.9%, confirming it was his DNA. On May 19th, the suspect was arrested at the border with Brazil. During the interrogation, Leonardo claimed that he had no connection to the crime. As for his DNA found on the identification card and the girl's towel, he explained that he found a pink backpack on the beach. When he looked inside, he saw a wallet with 2,000 pesos and stole the money. Regarding the blood, he said that a few hours before, he cut himself with a bottle shard at work, and when he reached into the backpack, the bandage fell off and the cut started bleeding. Therefore, he wiped his hand with Lola's towel. However, there were several inconsistencies in his version. Firstly, his blood was not simply found on the girl's belongings, it was mixed with her blood. This couldn't have happened if he found the backpack and just took out the wallet. Secondly, according to his own words, someone else, not Leonardo, took Lola's backpack on the 28th, the day of the murder, after Leonardo stole the money and inexplicably buried it 4 kilometers away from where it was found, without taking anything from it. Even the suspect couldn't deny the absurdity of this story. Finally, his colleagues who worked with him in December 2014 didn't recall the incident with a broken bottle and Leonardo's cut. Moreover, according to documentation, Leonardo was no longer employed at the brewery on the day of the crime. Here is what the police believe actually happened. In the middle of the day on December 28, 2014, when Lola went for a walk on the beach, she was intercepted by Leonardo and Angel. They dragged her into an area with dunes and bushes. There, Lola tried to escape, and the kidnappers struck her several times on the head and stabbed her in the neck, causing her to fall to her knees. However, these wounds were not fatal, and Lola continued to resist. It is likely that she also screamed loudly, trying to attract the attention of other vacationers or beach vendors. In an attempt to silence Lola, they pressed her face into the sand. They pressed for too long, causing Lola to suffocate. The police believe that the motive for the crime was violence, although the assailants were unable to carry out their intended act and ended up killing her because they did not expect such fierce resistance from the teenage girl. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Leonardo was previously tried for a case very similar to Lola's. That case occurred in 2009 when Leonardo was 26 years old. The victim was a 15-year-old girl, just like Lola. Leonardo followed her for several blocks before attacking her with a knife. He dragged the victim to a remote wooded area where he assaulted her. The Uruguayan police are convinced that at least 2 people were involved in the attack on Lola. Therefore, they charged Leonardo with aggravated murder and Angel with harboring a criminal. Jorge Base demanded a sentence of 10 years of imprisonment for Angel and 15 to 30 years for Leonardo. In June 2021, Angel, who had been in prison since 2019, was released by a judge's decision granting him conditional early release under oath. Despite psychiatric and psychological evaluations characterizing Angel as an aggressive and impulsive individual lacking impulse control, the judge found no grounds to accuse him of harboring a criminal, as harboring entails assisting the criminal after the crime has been committed. In this case, Angel should have been charged as an accomplice. Therefore, according to the judge, Angel Moreira's actions do not fall under the category of harboring. However, the prosecutor filed an appeal against the judge's decision, stating that Angel was present before, during, and after the crime. Despite their initial suspicions, Lola's parents, Adriana and Diego, trust the evidence presented by the police, agree that 2 suspects were involved in the crime, and hope for a swift verdict. On March 5, 2018, the medical staff at a hospital in San Diego, California, was awaiting the arrival of a 28-year-old patient named Brigida. She was being transported by an ambulance from her family doctor's office. On that day, Brigida called her mother, Olga, complaining of feeling unwell. Olga struggled to get her into the car. Brigida could barely breathe, and her legs trembled with excruciating pain. With just one look at the once vibrant and healthy young woman, The family doctor knew that Brigida was in critical condition and there was nothing he could do for her. Therefore, he called an ambulance to take her to the clinic. The emergency department medics were also alarmed that they might not be able to stabilize the patient's condition. Brigida was in unbearable pain, could hardly see anything, could barely speak, and had no sensation in her feet or hands. But the most puzzling symptom was that her once beautiful chestnut hair was falling out in clumps. The doctors began their work. They quickly determined that there were no external signs of trauma on her body. No bruises, wounds, or indications of infection. The cause of her illness was internal. Brigida's mother explained that her daughter had been suffering from sudden episodes of nausea, fatigue, and excruciating pain for several months. The symptoms would occur suddenly without any warning, causing her to spend days in bed. Brigida could barely take care of herself, let alone her husband and young son. Various specialists she consulted were at a loss, unable to understand what was afflicting her. Her symptoms did not match any known illness. One doctor even told her that her case was how critical days manifest. Finally, the doctors concluded that it was a result of stress and prescribed her tranquilizers. However, her condition worsened, her body was failing, and the medical staff in the emergency department of San Diego understood that if they didn't figure out what was wrong with her as soon as possible, the patient could die within days. Brigida grew up in California, just a few kilometers away from the border with Mexico. Her father worked at the customs between Mexico and the United States, while her mother took care of their two daughters, Brigida and her younger sister Olga. The girls grew up in a loving and caring family. Brigida happily attended a Catholic school, excelling in her studies. Her friends described her as the friendliest and kindest girl they knew. Brigida had a passion for running and even participated in competitions representing her school. It was through running that she met her future husband, Race Remington Uto. They met in high school. Race attended a different school but was also passionate about sports. At first, Brigida's family didn't pay much attention to their friendship because their daughter wasn't interested in dating boys. Her time was consumed by studying and sports. However, gradually, the young couple became more and more involved with each other and started dating. Race managed to bring out a more adventurous side of Brigida, and soon they became inseparable. Race had a highly ambitious goal. He dreamt of attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The acceptance rate for students was less than 8%, making it a challenging task. The applicant had to excel in school, work on personal development, engage in sports, participate in community life, engage in volunteer work, and much more. Surprisingly, Race managed to gain admission to the academy, and he moved to Maryland to begin his education. The young couple continued their relationship long distance. However, after some time, Race was diagnosed with a hernia that didn't resolve completely. He had to leave the academy but found work as an electrician in the Navy. Meanwhile, Brigida pursued her own plans and became a teacher. In 2014, after 7 years of being together, 25-year-old Brigida and 24-year-old Race got married. Soon after, they welcomed their son. Brigida believed she was perfectly happy with everything in her life going according to plan. She had a loving, caring husband, a wonderful child, and lived just steps away from her parents. However, her life would soon take an extraordinary and painful turn that she could never have imagined. Among the emergency department physicians at San Diego Hospital, there was a certified toxicologist named Dr. Jeff Lapointe, which was considered rare. He was a true medical detective, and like an excellent detective, Lapointe followed the trail of clues that could lead him to understand what was happening to Brigid. Was she being killed by an autoimmune disease? No, blood tests did not confirm that. Could she be suffering from cancer? No, although one symptom stood out among all others. Hair loss was not due to the disease but rather a result of therapy. All the symptoms indicated that Brigid had been exposed to a toxic chemical. But which one and how? Was it arsenic, cadmium, or cesium? No, because these heavy metals wouldn't result in hair loss. However, there was one substance that could: thallium. In the early 20th century, thallium was used as a depilatory agent. It was also actively utilized by doctors. For example, if a child had head lice, thallium was applied to their head, causing the lice to fall off along with all the hair. In subsequent years, thallium became the main component of rodent poisons. However, by the 1970s, its popularity as a murder weapon, alongside arsenic, had increased to the point where it was banned for sale and use. All of Brigid's symptoms, including leg pain, weakness, deteriorating vision, loss of appetite, weight loss, and, of course, hair loss, indicated thallium poisoning. The problem was that Dr. Lapointe couldn't confirm his suspicions quickly. Nobody in the hospital had encountered such a case before, and there was no way to test the patient for poisoning. The samples had to be sent to another laboratory, and the results would be available in 3 days. 3 days that Brigid might not have. The race against time had begun. Lapointe started calling all the agencies, requesting an expedited analysis. But even if the doctor's suspicions proved to be correct and Brigid was suffering from thallium poisoning, the antidote would be urgently needed. However, obtaining the antidote, poetically named Berlin Blue, turned out to be more challenging than he could ever imagine. We have all seen Berlin Blue because it is a blue pigment used in paints. Vincent van Gogh used it when painting Starry Night over the Rhone. This substance is also an antidote for poisoning by certain heavy metals, accelerating their elimination from the body. However, while you can buy blue paint at the nearest art supply store, obtaining medical-grade Berlin Blue is almost unrealistic. Lapointe called all the pharmacies, naval medical officers, clinics, but he found the antidote only at one warehouse, a classified warehouse in Los Angeles. The thing is, Berlin Blue is also an antidote for radiation exposure, such as in the case of a dirty bomb explosion. Therefore, the government keeps meticulous records of every tube of Berlin Blue in the country. And Dr. Lapointe couldn't count on getting the antidote until thallium poisoning was confirmed in the laboratory. When the toxicological analysis of Brigid's case arrived, Lapointe's worst fears were confirmed. The level of thallium in Brigid's body exceeded the permissible limit by 1,000 times. A hospital staff member drove all night to bring the antidote to San Diego. However, the doctor feared that with such a severe poisoning, one antidote might not be sufficient. He prescribed dialysis for the patient to cleanse her blood. It was a slow and painful process, and now all the medical staff and Brigid's family could do was wait and pray. Meanwhile, Brigid's husband and son were placed in another wing of the hospital to monitor their health. If she had been exposed to thallium, they could have been affected too. The main question remained: where could she have obtained such a large quantity of thallium? And the answer to that was being sought by FBI agents. It should be understood that all this was happening in a state with several military bases. Furthermore, these events unfolded against the backdrop of President Trump's planned visit. Therefore, when Dr. Lapointe started looking for Berlin Blue, the FBI agents became very interested in what was happening in the city. FBI agents and police have discovered that several months ago, Brigid underwent treatment at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico when she began experiencing an unexplained illness. The police investigated this lead but ultimately dismissed it. The school where Brigid taught was a former military base during World War II, where rodent poisoning could have occurred in the past. In that year, many teachers at the school fell ill. However, this lead also turned out to be a dead end. Investigators could not dismiss the possibility that Brigid had used thallium herself as a cry for attention due to her depression. But everyone who knew her claimed that she loved life and would never abandon her son. Furthermore, her depression emerged after the appearance of unexplained symptoms, not the other way around. Dr. Lapointe had his own suspicions about how his patient had been poisoned. He conducted a scan of Brigid's internal organs and was horrified to discover numerous white spots throughout her digestive tract. It became evident that the poison was entering her body through food. Someone close to her had attempted the perfect crime. Dr. Lapointe ordered complete isolation for the patient, allowing no one to visit her or provide her with food except what was provided by the hospital. However, at that moment, food was the least of her concerns. Brigid regained consciousness thanks to the antidote after a few days. All her hair had fallen out, and she couldn't sit or move, but she was alive. She couldn't name anyone who would wish her harm. However, the police knew that poisoning is always a personal crime committed by a close friend or family member. It was also interesting that Brigid's husband and child were unharmed. The police spoke with her sister, parents, and husband, all of whom were eager to help with the investigation. Ray wept and lamented that he couldn't switch places with his wife to relieve her suffering. He said what the detectives wanted to hear, yet investigators sensed falsehood in his words. The medical staff also noted that he didn't seem as concerned and asked strange and sometimes inappropriate questions. Response to the suspicion regarding her husband's involvement, Brigid became angered and vehemently denied it. She insisted that Ray had been caring for her when she was unwell, taking care of their son and bringing her to the hospital. Furthermore, he would prepare meals when she lacked the strength to get out of bed. However, during the conversation with Brigid, the investigators learned something that sent chills down their spines. Ray had a rather unusual hobby. He enjoyed collecting rare seeds of poisonous plants. This piqued the police's interest, and after 16 days of Brigid's hospitalization, the police gathered enough evidence to search their home. Ray opened the door and appeared somewhat agitated. The detectives asked him to hand over all the family's gadgets, and he willingly surrendered all the phones and laptops. However, he couldn't help but notice that all the search histories on the devices had recently been cleared. Despite the supposedly deleted data on his phone, the police found 2 books in Ray's mobile, Criminal Poisoning and The Poisoner's Handbook. According to the Poisoner's Handbook, thallium gives the poisoner the ability to control how quickly their victim dies. The poisoning presents itself as a medical enigma, with the patient slowly deteriorating for unknown reasons. There were even more intriguing discoveries. In Ray's car, they found a canister of acetone and a packet of exotic seeds hidden in a small compartment in the spare tire. Additionally, Brigid's sister handed over a black garbage bag that she retrieved from the trash bin, as their mother noticed Ray throwing it away just before the police arrived. Inside were receipts for exotic seeds such as tick seed, crea nut, and Cerbera odolum, along with various tools for their filtration and grinding. In other words, everything necessary for the production of rare poisons. It was evident that the man had already attempted to crush tick seeds to obtain ricin, a poison toxic to mice but dangerous to humans if inhaled or ingested. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there were no traces of thallium found in the house, garage, or car. Therefore, there was no basis for arresting Ray. All they could do was share their suspicions with Brigid and ask her not to return home. She still couldn't believe their words, but she didn't object to the continuation of the investigation. The investigators continued to dig deeper and discover the possible motive for the murder. Ray had a lover who believed he was a widower. He lied to her, claiming to be a Navy SEAL and expressing his goal to work for the FBI in the poisoning division. He didn't hesitate to bring his young son on their dates, and the boy had grown so attached to the woman that he called her mom. Leading a double life, Ray went even further and started another affair, confessing to the woman that he was married. However, he hoped that his wife would be hit by a bus, so he wouldn't have to share custody of their son. It's unclear why this didn't alarm the woman. Nonetheless, it was clear that the man wanted to end his relationship with Brigid. But as a devout Catholic, she had warned him before their marriage that she did not believe in divorce and that if they married, it would be for life. She could hardly have expected her unfaithful husband to take this ending so literally. The detectives asked Ray to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. When the polygraph examiner informed him of the results, he didn't attempt to deny it and confessed to everything. Race stated that he ordered thallium online 3 times. In August 2017, he first attempted to add it to his wife's food by preparing her a sandwich for breakfast. He calculated the amount of thallium based on her weight. The next day, Brigida felt unwell, but it didn't kill her. She started to recover. In December of the same year, Race added a slightly larger amount of thallium to the soup. Again, he didn't achieve the desired effect. In January, he increased the dosage 5-fold and once again hid the poison in a sandwich. He intended to kill Brigida within days. She felt terrible, experienced excruciating pain, and began losing her hair, but she continued to fight for her life. After confessing, Race was arrested. 8 months later, he pleaded guilty to 3 attempts to murder his wife. His lawyer tried to argue that Race suffered a spinal injury while serving in the Navy, and the pain clouded his judgment. However, this defense did not help. On March 14, 2019, he was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments ranging from 21 years to life. He may be eligible for parole in October 2033. If he is lucky and succeeds in his first attempt at freedom, he will serve only 14 years in prison and become a free man before his 42nd birthday. During the trial, Brigida was finally able to address her husband personally. She said, "I wanted to believe that I knew the man I married 3 years ago, the man I had been dating for nearly 10 years. I wanted to believe that he would never harm me. I am horrified by the thought that he could be responsible for attempting to kill me. How could you do this to the mother of your child? Why do you think you have the right to decide that I am not a worthy mother for your son? How could you decide that the way to end our marriage is by slowly killing your wife, watching her suffer for months? I cared for you and I loved you." Every time Brigida recalls the incident, she breaks into a cold sweat. She felt unwell and was lying in bed. Her husband brought her a sandwich with peanut butter. Their little son climbed onto the bed and asked for a bit. Race immediately shouted at her not to give him any. Brigida doesn't know if there was thallium in that sandwich, but she believes her son was at least on the brink of severe poisoning. Despite Brigida's reluctance to admit divorce, she eventually divorced Race. She still suffers from constant fatigue, weakness in her legs, and nerve damage. However, she is gradually recovering and has returned to work at a school for children with special needs. She admits that now it is much easier for her to find an approach to each student. Brigida, who once couldn't walk, is now running again, trying skydiving, and striving to live life to the fullest. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statement she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to help Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schmidt was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car. Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Van Ber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, the young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Van Ber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The 2 reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Marc's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Marc were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Marc with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Marc never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Marc's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Marc's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. It is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all since, theoretically, he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Marc Van Ver did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Marc suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Marc hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed two almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van B family would never have suspected her of anything. Such a case has never occurred with investigators from South Dakota. There are 3 suspects, the husband, the lover, and the 12-year-old daughter, each with a motive for committing a heinous crime, but only one of them is guilty. Will the detectives be able to uncover the truth, navigating through the depths of anonymous letters, spy devices, and false evidence amidst the ocean of passions that unfolded around what seemed to be an ordinary American family? On the morning of Wednesday, February 8, 2006, Wyoming resident Bonnie Burns was sitting by the phone, eagerly awaiting a call from her daughter, 41-year-old Tammy Rhea, who lived in Pierre, South Dakota. Every morning for many years, Tammy would call Bonnie without fail. The sudden silence from her daughter frightened Bonnie, so she decided to call herself. Tammy's home phone went unanswered, and her mobile phone redirected the call to voicemail. She was also absent from her job in the shoe department at Kmart. Contemplating what to do next, Bonnie recalled the name of one of her daughter's colleagues, Brian. Tammy had recently mentioned to the family that she had been communicating with Brian frequently. Therefore, Bonnie dialed the store number again, this time inquiring if Brian was present. Brian Clark answered Bonnie's call in surprise. He also didn't know where Tammy was. However, in response to Bonnie's desire to contact the police, he asked her to provide him with the details. He dialed 911 and reported that he needed to report a missing person. Brian added that a crime may have occurred. When asked by the dispatcher why he believed so, he replied that he and Tammy were having an affair, and it was evident that her husband had found out about it. When 12-year-old Haley Rhea sat down to have breakfast, she immediately felt that something was off. Her father, Brad Rhea, was also seated at the table, but her mother was nowhere to be found. Tammy always busied herself in the kitchen, but now the house was unusually quiet. Haley walked into her mother's bedroom. All her belongings were still there. Her SUV was parked in the garage. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. Her mother couldn't have left without her purse, phone, or keys. They had spent the evening together, while her father, as usual, worked late, and her mother never once mentioned that she had plans in the morning. Perplexed about where she could be, Haley asked her father. In a hushed voice, Brad replied, "Sweetheart, she's probably with her boyfriend. She'll be back in 2 days." Tammy and Brad met in Billings, Montana. The young couple started dating right away, and within a year, Tammy was expecting a child. It was her dream to get married and become a mother. Tammy took care of Haley and the household while Brad focused on his career. In 2004, Brad's hard work paid off when he was offered a promotion to assistant manager at Walmart, but it required the family to relocate to Pierre. Although it was the administrative center of South Dakota, the town had less than 14,000 residents and lacked any significant entertainment options. One notable attraction in Pierre was the dam and the adjacent lake, a popular spot for fishing and hunting. However, it provided a picturesque and peaceful setting for the family, so Brad accepted the offer. The move from a big city wasn't easy for the family, but after some time, life in the new place began to settle. Hay found a few sports clubs to join, and Tammy found work at a store where she met Brian Clark. Unlike her husband, who loved his wife but couldn't devote enough attention due to work, Brian was always there for her. The news of her mother having a boyfriend came as a thunderbolt out of the blue for Haley. Although her parents had informed her 2 weeks earlier that they had decided to get divorced, this news caught her completely off guard. Her parents had explained to her that her father had been working incredibly long hours, sometimes up to 100 hours a week, and it had taken a toll on their marriage. However, They had promised to stay together until the end of the school year so that the changes wouldn't affect Haley's education. And now, with her father announcing that her mother had a boyfriend, Haley didn't know what to think. After dropping his daughter off at school, Brad headed to work. As soon as he entered, 2 police officers approached him. When Brad heard that his wife had gone missing, he was shocked. He explained that he hadn't seen Tammy since the previous day. When he arrived home from work after 10 p.m., his daughter was already asleep and Tammy wasn't home. Around 1 a.m., Brad heard a car screech to a halt outside. He glanced out the window and saw Tammy park her black SUV, get into another car, and drive away with a man. Brad had recently discovered that his wife was seeing someone else and assumed it was his car. Succumbing to a sudden impulse, he got into Tammy's SUV and followed them, but soon his wife's car broke down and Brad had to pull over on the side of the road. A passing patrol officer stopped to assist Brad. By the time the car started again, he had lost sight of his wife, so he returned home and went to sleep. The next morning, she was still missing, and he assumed she had gone somewhere with the other man. The detectives listened attentively to Brad's account of the events from the previous night. The store manager, a man of small stature and meek appearance, didn't seem like a threatening individual, and his behavior didn't indicate any signs of lying. The police asked if Tammy could have already returned home, and Brad willingly agreed to accompany them. It was a trick. The officers had already been inside the house and one of them noticed something through the garage window that caught his attention. When Brad allowed them to search his home, one officer went inside while the other headed straight to the garage. There, he noticed a reddish-brown stain on Tammy's car door. As he approached, he saw blood dripping from the vehicle's threshold. There was too much of it, and when the police officer opened the door, he was nearly overwhelmed by the powerful smell of bleach. Everything indicated a crime, but the officers didn't want to alarm Brad, who could demand the search to stop at any moment. The police decided to employ another trick. They asked Brad to drive with them to the station to answer some questions. And while the owner was not at home, they would request an official search warrant. Simultaneously, during the questioning of Brad, the police spoke with Haley. The girl shared that her parents never argued and her father devoted every spare moment to the family. That's why the news of their divorce was such a surprise. Haley noticed that the impending divorce had also taken a toll on her father. He had been very moody in recent days, hardly eating anything, and he had called Tammy, pleading for her help in saving their marriage. Meanwhile, Haley's mother had behaved as usual. Tammy told her family that the house would stay with her and Haley, and Brad would move out. The family confirmed the girl's words. Tammy was looking forward to the divorce. She informed her relatives that the house would remain with her and Haley, and Brad would relocate. At the police station, Brad cooperated fully, answering all the questions. His wife had recently confessed to him that she had fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce, but Brad didn't know who the other person was. He adamantly denied any involvement in Tammy's disappearance and insisted that he had no idea where she might be. When the detectives informed him about the blood found on the car, he was shocked. While Brad was being questioned, the police obtained a search warrant for his home and thoroughly examined every room, but everything seemed completely normal except for the blood in Tammy's car. It was a cozy home of an ordinary family. The amount of blood found in Tammy's SUV indicated that she had suffered serious harm and was likely killed. In such a case, Brad was the most likely suspect, given his wife's desire for a divorce, which provided a motive. They interrogated him for 5 hours until he insisted on having a lawyer. Although they weren't 100% certain that Tammy had been killed, they couldn't release the suspect either, as he could potentially destroy any evidence. The police had no choice but to arrest Brad on the first-degree murder charge. While Brad Rea was under arrest, the investigators invited Brian Clark to the police station. He arrived with his lawyer. Just like Tammy, Brian also had a family, a wife and a daughter. Brian told the detectives that he had last seen Tammy the day before her disappearance. They met at a motel, and then Brian dropped Tammy off at her home around 5 p.m. afterward. He went to a basketball game with his wife and daughter. He spent the entire evening and the night at home. Brian mentioned that his wife could confirm his alibi, but she was unaware of his affair with Tammy, and he preferred it to stay that way. Once again, the detectives didn't know what to think. The man genuinely seemed concerned about Tammy, but the fact that he immediately appeared with a lawyer raised suspicions. Additionally, the fact that Brian's wife was unaware of her husband's infidelity provided him with a motive for murder. Perhaps, if Tammy had confessed to Brian, she demanded that her lover do the same, urging him to get a divorce or even threatening to talk to Brian's wife, pushing him over the edge. Access to Tammy's SUV was in the hands of her husband, but if his story about surveilling his wife was true, Brian could have killed Tammy and doused the car in blood to frame her husband. The police tracked down the patrol officer who had stopped to help Brad start his car, and he confirmed Brad's account word for word. Now, the police had confirmation of the story he had consistently repeated. So, who was the killer if the murder indeed took place? No matter how you look at it, without a body, the case couldn't progress any further. On February 9th, search teams began combing the extensive area around the city, where rarely anyone could be found except for hunters who frequented the hilly shores from October to January. If Tammy was here, it was unlikely that anyone would stumble upon her before the start of the next hunting season, 8 months later. By that time, wild animals would most likely have discovered her remains first. The teams covered kilometer after kilometer, but the woman was nowhere to be found. As the sun approached the horizon, the helicopter pilot decided to fly over the isolated plain, approximately 16 kilometers north of the city, one more time. While flying over the marshland near the dam, he spotted Tammy Ria's lifeless body. As it turned out, the woman had been stabbed at least 35 times. It felt as if the killer had unleashed immense fury upon her. It was an extremely brutal murder, but there was no blood around the body, indicating that the attack had taken place elsewhere. The officers found a t-shirt and 2 blood-stained gloves, but there was nothing that could provide clues to the identity of the killer. Neither the autopsy nor another search of the family's home yielded any results. The investigators had no choice but to interrogate Brian's wife. It presented an excellent opportunity for the betrayed woman to seek revenge, but she didn't take advantage of it. She confirmed that her husband was at home on the night of February 7th. However, despite the couple sleeping in the same bedroom, the woman suffered from back pain and often spent the night downstairs in a reclining chair. That was the case on the night of Tammy's murder. Therefore, Brian could have slipped out of the house in the middle of the night without his wife knowing. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. Suddenly, the case took a completely unexpected turn. A letter was delivered to the office of the district attorney. It was written by one of Brian Clark's cousins. The man could no longer stay silent and wanted to unburden himself. According to the letter, Brian confessed that on Tuesday, February 7th, he met with Tammy at the motel and they agreed to meet again later. Brian arrived at Tammy's house late at night. They took 2 blankets and set off in Tammy's SUV out of town. After spreading the blankets, Tammy undressed, leaving only her t-shirt, and asked Brian to wear a condom, but he refused. Tammy's persistence infuriated him. He attacked her, and they struggled for some time before Brian forcefully got what he wanted. However, during the assault, the condom remained inside Tammy's body. In a fit of rage, Brian grabbed a knife and attacked Tammy. After killing her, he wrapped her body in the blankets and placed it in the SUV. He then returned home and parked the car in the garage. Brian had to share everything with his brother, who helped him get rid of the evidence. Many of the facts listed in the letter were not known to the public. The anonymous author could only have learned them from the killer. But there was one hitch. The initial autopsy did not reveal any condom. To uncover the truth, another autopsy was conducted. Incredibly, upon re-examining the body, the pathologist discovered this crucial piece of evidence that had somehow been missed the first time. The discovery promised to provide the much-awaited clue that the investigators were hoping for. However, due to the time the condom had spent inside Tammy's body, the DNA sample could not be used for comparison. What seemed like a promising piece of evidence raised even more questions. Whoever wrote the letter undoubtedly knew all the information about the murder, but there was still no physical evidence proving that Brian was the killer. Now the investigators understood what Brad was talking about during his initial interrogation. Even when it was unknown whether Tammy was killed, he had said, "All this evidence points to me, but I hope there will be a body because there will be something that will exonerate me. Maybe DNA, something like that." Brad could only hope for such evidence if he himself planted it in an attempt to frame Brian. The question was, how did he obtain Brian's DNA? The investigators talked to Brian and learned that he often disposed of used condoms by throwing them out of the car window. It turned out that Brad had followed multiple lovers before. By tracking them, he discovered Brian's habit, which allowed him to devise a cunning plan to frame his rival. Of course, Brad couldn't have known that DNA would not be suitable for analysis if it remained in another person's body for a long time. The biggest problem remained that the investigators still didn't know where the murder took place. The police returned to the family's house for another search, hoping to find the slightest clue. In Brad's closet, an officer found something intriguing, a tiny digital recorder. When the detectives pressed the playback button, Tammy's voice filled the room. She asked to call Brian Clark. They spoke for a few minutes, and then Tammy said, "I love you very, very much." Since the beginning of the investigation, Brad had claimed that he didn't know who Tammy was seeing. But on the recording, Brian's name was clearly heard. Brad had set a trap to find out who his wife was meeting. He had placed the recorder in her car, along with a bouquet and a note. As Brad had hoped, Tammy assumed the flowers were from her lover and called Brian to thank him, inadvertently revealing his identity. Now the police wanted to know what else Brad might have been lying about and how he managed to send an anonymous letter while being in prison. Brad regularly communicated with his twin brother, Brett Rhea. When Brett was released from prison after a visit to his brother, the police were already following him. Upon his arrest, they discovered a very interesting notepad in his possession. It listed all the facts that later appeared in the anonymous letter. Additionally, they found a letter from Brad describing excellent fishing spots. He drew a map indicating several locations near the dam. Considering the murder charges against him, it was unlikely that he would be thinking about something as trivial as fishing. The marked locations were significant for another reason. Following the instructions, the officers found 3 large black garbage bags containing blood-soaked beddings. The bags also contained blood-stained rubber gloves, women's underwear, and a large tarp. The tarp explained why there was no trace of blood in the Rhea family's house. Here's how events likely unfolded on that night. Brad had prearranged the tarp on Tammy's mattress and placed several sheets over it to ensure she wouldn't notice anything. When she lay down on the bed on the night of February 7th, Brad entered the room and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times through the sheets and slashing her throat. The bedding immediately absorbed all the blood. Brad then carried Tammy's wrapped body, along with the sheets, to the garage, located right next to her bedroom. He placed her body in the car, planted the evidence, and loaded her body and the bags of bedding. As for Brad's story about breaking down on the road and interacting with the patrol officer, he was likely on the verge of getting caught. He was heading to Brian's house, intending to plant some evidence, confident that the condom would lead investigators to his rival. And when he realized that he wasn't discovered during the autopsy, he had to devise a plan involving the letter with a false confession and seek his brother's help to send it. The trial began in January 2007. Since the prosecutor did not seek the death penalty for Brad, in the event of a guilty verdict under South Dakota law, he would automatically receive a life sentence. The prosecutor expected the process to be brief and clear-cut, but Brad made the rare decision for a defendant to testify in his own defense. No one could have anticipated what he would say when he took the witness stand. Unable to hide the lie any longer, Brad felt that he had to confess everything. It was not him who killed Tammy, but his now 13-year-old daughter, Haley. Problems started after Haley was informed that her parents were getting divorced. She was furious because her parents didn't want to reconcile and spent whole days in a saddened state. On the night of February 7th, Brad returned late from work and his wife and daughter were already asleep. He also went to bed but was awakened by the cat around midnight. Brad heard some noise coming from Tammy's room and went to check what was happening. To his horror, he saw Haley standing over her mother's body. She was covered in blood and holding a knife. There was blood coming from her nose, indicating that Tammy must have fought back. Brad shouted, asking Haley what she had done, but she stood motionless and didn't respond. Brad attempted to help his wife but realized it was futile. His daughter continued to stand there, showing no emotions. It was only then that Brad realized she was asleep. In panic, he took the girl back to her room and wiped off all the blood. He then tried to clean the crime scene. He put the clothes in the washing machine and took his wife to the car. To protect his daughter, he decided to frame a man whom Tammy had seen. When Haley woke up the next day, she behaved completely normally, and Brad realized that she didn't remember anything that had happened. Initially, he wanted to escape to Mexico with his daughter, but he was arrested before he could do so. Brad explained that his daughter always had behavioral problems and had even stabbed her stuffed toys when she was a little child. He admitted that he had broken the law and deserved punishment, but only for trying to protect his child. The prosecutor was pleased that Brad provided testimony because attempting to accuse his daughter would have enraged the jury members. In reality, the evidence indicated that the wounds on Tammy's body could not have been inflicted by a 12-year-old girl, even considering that she was a fairly strong volleyball player. During the cross-examination, the defendant couldn't explain facts that had already been reliably established. Moreover, Brad's twin brother had already confessed to everything. It took the jury 3 hours to deliver a guilty verdict. Nevertheless, Brad Rea insists on his story. He unsuccessfully filed an appeal, claiming that he was framed by investigators and that his daughter's DNA was never compared to the DNA at the crime scene. The most terrifying part is that if a condom with Brian Clark's DNA had been found during the initial autopsy, this case could have ended completely differently. The fact that the intended evidence was not found compelled Brad to bury himself deeper, acting out of desperation. Haley Rea lost both of her parents on the day her father decided to kill her mother. She moved to live with relatives in Wyoming and never saw Brad again. Fortunately, she didn't allow the incident to break her. The immense love that surrounded her mother became a source of motivation for the girl. Speaking out on public platforms, she became the voice of domestic violence victims who can no longer stand up for themselves. Haley pursued an education in criminal law, got married, became a mother, and only regrets that her son will never know what a wonderful, kind, and loving person his grandmother was. November 4th, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Photopulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Photopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Photopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Photopulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Brigida Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Brigida turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Brigida was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, He became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Photopulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Photopoulos bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the photopulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt, but if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at Co-Star's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Photopulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Costar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Costar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. Christy Marceau woke up from a sudden phone call. The girl was sleeping in her room. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2011, and the 18-year-old student from the University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, didn't need to get up early. The phone stopped ringing before Christy picked up the receiver. But then, a few seconds later, it rang again. The girl answered. A male voice on the other end of the line asked to speak to Christy. "This is Christy," the girl said. It turned out that the caller was her acquaintance, Akshay Chan. Until recently, they both worked at a local supermarket. They weren't friends, but they sometimes talked at work and outside of it, exchanging messages on Facebook. They lived just a few blocks apart, and Akshay had come to Christy's house a few times. He often needed someone to talk to about his personal problems. Kind and compassionate, Christy was always ready to listen to him. The girl knew that Akshay had been going through a tough time lately, but she couldn't imagine what he would say next. Her heart sank when he uttered, "I dissolved 40 tablets in a drink, and if you don't come to my house within 10 minutes, I will drink it." Without a second thought, the girl hurried to help Akshay. Christy was in such a rush after Akshay's call that she had hardly any time to get dressed. She quickly put on sweatpants and a sweater over her sleepwear, grabbed her keys and mobile phone, jumped into her car, and drove about a kilometer to Akshay's house. It was unusual for Christy to ignore a cry for help. She always tried to assist those who had a harder time in life. Unlike the sociable Christy, Akshay Chand didn't have many friends. Everyone recognized his extraordinary intellect, but he found it difficult to communicate with other kids, especially girls. When fate brought them together at work in a local supermarket, Akshay began sharing his inner struggles with her. The girl sympathized with him, but in June 2011, she started a new job and saw Akshay much less frequently. By the time he called her on September 6th, a considerable amount of time had passed since their last meeting. Christy had only 2 minutes to arrive at the apartment building where the guy lived with his mother and younger sister. She parked her car, rushed up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Akshay let her inside. Christy followed him through the entrance door, which he locked behind them. There was no one else at home. Akshay's mother was at work, and his 16-year-old sister was at school. As Christy sat down in a chair opposite him, she noticed a small amount of white powder on the table. It looked like someone had crushed tablets. Obviously, Chand hadn't lied when he mentioned the glass with the medication. Christy asked him where the drink was. "Do you think I'm that stupid?" He replied, "Of course, I hid it because I knew you would find it." Concerned, the girl tried to persuade Akshay to seek professional help. Her words disappointed him. From his perspective, Christy wasn't helping him cope with depression after she left the supermarket. Christy explained that she was torn between her university studies and her new job. But Chand argued that she could spare 5 minutes to chat with him on Facebook, and that would be enough. Then he added, "Let's face it, you weren't that busy." Christy became increasingly uneasy. The more he blamed her, the more she explained that she couldn't help him. He needed to reach out to a specialist. This angered Akshay even more. He jumped out of his chair and reached into his pocket for a kitchen knife. The knife was long and very sharp. Akshay held onto the handle tightly, brandishing it in front of Christy. "This is how we're going to do it," he said. "If you scream, I'll stab you with the knife." Christy began whimpering in response, prompting Chand to order her to be quiet and calm down. The girl still held onto her mobile phone, contemplating how to send a message to her friend asking for help. But Chand noticed the phone and demanded that she hand it over. Christy clung to her phone tightly, as if it were her only connection to the outside world. Failing to forcefully take the phone from her, Chand threatened the girl again, implying he would resort to using the weapon. He snatched the girl's mobile phone, and suddenly, Chand began to talk. He declared that he had big plans for the day. He decided to scare the girl, seek revenge on her for not supporting him during his most difficult period, and finally put an end to everything in one fell swoop. Then he demanded that Christy take off her sweater and hand it over to him. After searching through it, he demanded her blue top. The girl refused, but predictably, the guy threatened her with the knife. Christy complied. Then he ordered her to stand up and show that she wasn't hiding anything in her pants. She emptied her pockets, but it wasn't enough for him, and he wanted her to remove the sweatpants she was wearing. Christy refused and broke down in even greater tears. But realizing that she had no choice, she undressed, leaving herself only in her underwear. Chand crumpled her clothes into a pile, sat back in the chair, and began rambling about various things. He spouted nonsense about how people like Christy make others suffer. He accused her of coming to him only when it was already too late. Overall, more time had passed since Christy arrived at his place. Terrified, she asked if he planned to kill her. Chand reminded her of his plans for the day to frighten her, seek revenge, and drink the prepared drink. He hadn't previously specified how he planned to seek revenge, but now he was ready to tell her. Akshay Chand wanted to violate Christy. Upon hearing this, the girl burst into tears, which prompted Chand to ask her to calm down. Then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He returned Christy's clothes, phone, and told her she could leave. Still overwhelmed with fear, Christy initially didn't believe the sudden change in the guy's mood. What if he planned to stab her in the back, catching her off guard when she turned away? She shared her concerns with Chand, forcing him to lower the knife. "I'm letting you go, but you should know that as soon as you leave, I will drink the concoction," he said. Christy once again tried to persuade him to abandon this plan. Despite what he had put her through, her character didn't allow her to leave after such words. But Chand insisted. Too frightened to linger any longer, Christy turned around and ran out of the apartment. She hurried down the stairs to her car. Passers-by walked by, unaware of what had just happened to her. Christy wanted to ask one of them for help, but she realized she wouldn't feel safe until she reached home. Getting into her car, Christy locked the doors, started the engine, and drove home. From the perspective of Christy's parents, Brian and Tracy Marceau, she was their little miracle. After the birth of their first child, a girl named Heather, Tracy and Brian Marceau had been trying to become parents again. However, it took 6 years before Christy was born. By 2011, the very close-knit family members were living far apart. Heather had moved out of the family home a few years ago, and Brian was working in Australia. Tracy was planning to move to Australia soon to be closer to her husband. Christy was also looking forward to the move. As her first year at the University of Auckland's School of Hospitality and Tourism approached its end, where she was studying event management, she could continue her education in Australia. By the age of 30, the young woman dreamed of starting her own event planning company. Currently, she still lived in her parents' home, where she grew up in the suburb of Hillcrest. On the morning of the attack on Christy, Tracy was at work when her phone rang around 11:30 a.m. It was her mother, Shirley, who lived together with Tracy and Christy in the same house. Tracy answered, and in the background, she heard Christy's hysterical crying. Then she heard her mother's voice, telling her to come home immediately because Christy had been attacked. Tracy arrived home within 15 minutes. Upon seeing her mother, Christy threw herself into her arms and didn't want to let go. Trembling and crying incessantly, she recounted what Akshay Chand had done to her. Tracy hardly knew Akshay, but she remembered that once, while seeing off Brian at the airport, they returned home with their daughter and found him waiting at the doorstep. Akshay and Christy chatted briefly. Christy assured her mother that she just needed someone to talk to, but Tracy didn't like him right away. He evoked a strange feeling in her, and she asked her daughter to stop communicating with him. However, the girl was confident that there was nothing to worry about, and Tracy had never heard of Akshay again until this incident. Shocked by the details of what had happened, Tracy immediately took her daughter to the police station. In the police station, Christy repeated her account of the attack. She didn't know why Akshay had a change of heart and let her go, but she was certain that it wasn't the end and that he would attack her again because he had been stalking her for some time. She didn't tell her parents that she had found him sitting on the steps of her house on more than one occasion. At one point, he left a note for her in the mailbox, confessing his love and thanking her for the support she had provided, which he desperately needed. Chand also insisted that Christy accept a large sum of money as a gift. She took the money but didn't spend it, believing that he would demand it back. And indeed, a few days later, he did. When she left work at the supermarket, Chand quit his job on the same day, stating that he had no reason to stay there without her. After that, their communication ceased, and it became evident that Akshay had built up a lot of anger towards Christy, believing that she had abandoned him. The thought of him being out there frightened her, and the police recognized the danger she faced. As a result, Akshay Chand was promptly placed under arrest. Akshay admitted to everything and stated that the drink he threatened to consume contained multivitamins. However, he genuinely believed that consuming them in large quantities was toxic. In the police station, he calmly explained that his motive was revenge. Chand was angry at Christie because she didn't help him with his depression, and he openly expressed that he still harbored thoughts of vengeance. The police were extremely concerned about his behavior. It was a significant leap from someone who had never had any issues with the law to a criminal charged with abduction, attempted sexual assault, and threats of harm. Since he was still angry at Christie, the detectives knew it was crucial to keep Chand in custody until he could appear in court. They prepared a document outlining the reasons why Chand should not be released on bail, emphasizing Christie's fear and the proximity of their homes. They highlighted the fact that he could appear at her doorstep within minutes if he desired. 3 days after the attack, Akshay appeared in court. His lawyer argued that her client should be released on bail because he was only 18 years old. According to the law at that time, individuals over 17 but under 20 years old were typically eligible for bail if they had no prior convictions. Since Chand had never been arrested before, his lawyer claimed that he should be granted bail. She promised that he would take antidepressant medication, and if released on bail, his family would supervise him. However, the judge believed that it was not appropriate to release a person who had shown unwavering determination to carry out his actions. Despite the law, the judge stated that the only circumstance in which he would consider granting bail was if Chand agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. However, this option was unlikely. Therefore, the judge decided to defer the bail decision and requested a psychiatric evaluation for Akshay. Throughout this time, Christie continued to suffer. Her father was scheduled to return from Australia in a week, and she convinced her family not to inform him about what had happened so that he could continue working without worry. Initially, she was afraid not only to travel in public transportation but even to sleep in her own room. Whenever she heard any sound at night, she immediately asked her family to check what it was. Her greatest fear was that Akshay would be released and would attack her family or fixate on another innocent girl. By early November, life began to slowly improve. Chand was scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday, November 9th, and in 2 months, Christie and her family would be living in Australia. The relocation, which was initially meant to mark the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives, now became an urgent necessity. On the morning of November 7th, Tracy got up at 6:30 and began preparing for her workday. She let the dogs out, made breakfast, and took a shower. As she was getting dressed, she heard a knock on the door. It was still early, around 7 a.m., but Tracy wasn't surprised by the knock. Christie loved shopping online, and her orders were usually delivered in the morning. While Christie was still asleep, getting some rest before her late shift at work, Tracy went to answer the door herself. There was a young man standing on the porch. Tracy didn't recognize him immediately, but then she realized it was Akshay Chanda. He was holding a knife. Tracy felt fear grip her as Chanda forced his way into her home. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping that Christie would hear and understand that something terrible was happening and have time to escape. Or maybe the neighbors would hear and come to their aid. Still threatening Tracy with the knife, Chanda asked who else was in the house. Tracy lied and said her husband was home. That was not true. He had already returned to Australia. He had wanted to leave work, but the police convinced him that his family would be safe. But somehow Chanda seemed to know this, which made Tracy suspect he had been watching them for some time. Suddenly, Christie appeared on the stairs near Tracy and Chanda. Barefoot and in her sleepwear, she was awakened by her mother's scream and went upstairs to find out what was happening. When she saw Chanda, Christie screamed. Frozen with fear, she stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move. Chanda continued to direct the knife at Tracy, slowly advancing toward Christie. Then he kicked her in the chest, causing her to tumble down the stairs. Christie got up, ran down the steps, but slipped in her haste and fell again. She then got up and ran through her grandmother's room and into the backyard. Chanda chased after her. Meanwhile, Tracy called the police. Given what Chanda had done previously, she thought he might be trying to scare Christy again. She was confident that Christy would be able to lock herself in her grandmother's room, and Chanda wouldn't be able to reach her. The police were aware of the situation. They would be there within a few minutes and arrest Chanda. Tracy dialed emergency services. But before she could provide her address, she heard a frantic scream. It was Christy. Tracy dropped the phone and ran downstairs. Christy lay on the porch in the backyard, with a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Chanda stood nearby. Tracy rushed to her daughter and embraced her. She couldn't see any wounds, but Christy couldn't move. It seemed difficult for her to breathe. Tracy repeatedly told her daughter that she loved her and begged her to hold on because help was on the way. It seemed to Tracy that Christy was trying to say something to her. Looking into her eyes, Tracy saw that life had just left them. Christy was gone. Chanda just stood there. When Tracy looked at him, she saw that he still held the knife. The blade was bent at a 90-degree angle. Chanda himself was covered in blood. Showing no concern about what might happen to her next, Tracy screamed that he had killed Christy. With a completely emotionless voice, he replied, "I'm glad." The police arrived less than 10 minutes after the attack began. Chanda was still in the backyard, listening to music on an iPad. The broken knife lay on the ground. An officer asked what he was doing there. Chanda replied, "Retribution." Another officer noticed that Chanda's hands were trembling and asked why. He responded, "It's not easy to kill someone, is it?" Chanda was arrested and taken to the police station. Tracy had the difficult task of informing Heather and Brian about what had just happened to Christy. The Marceau family had been convinced that something like this would happen ever since Chanda was released on bail a month earlier. Initially, the judge denied his release, citing the need for further information about the case and the defendant's health condition. However, since he qualified for bail under the law, his lawyer quickly filed 2 applications for release. Chanda wrote a letter to the new judge, David McNaughton, expressing remorse for the attack on Christy. He stated that he deeply regretted what he had put the girl through and, given the opportunity, he would apologize to her and her family. Christy also wrote a letter to the judge, pleading not to release Akshay. She believed that since he had nothing to lose, he would attempt to attack her again. On October 5th, the judge granted Chanda bail, despite reading Christy's letter and being aware that the police also believed it was right to keep him behind bars. Chanda was allowed to return to his home, which was located just 350 meters away from Christy's house, in a straight line. The police were extremely disappointed but assured the Marceau family that they would protect them. Officers promised to check on Chanda at various times of the day, making sure he was at home. All the officers patrolling the area were informed about the case. Overall, the police visited Chanda 23 times in the 32 days he was free, and each time he was at home. Despite the police assurances, Christy's fears grew. And after 32 days, he showed up at her doorstep with a knife. Forensic experts investigating the scene of her death found the knife Chanda used to stab her 10 to 15 times before it bent 90 degrees and became useless. He attacked her from behind, delivering a powerful blow to the back of her head. She fell to the floor, where Chanda continued to strike her on the back. One wound was so severe that Christy almost felt nothing afterwards. In the police station, Chanda was surprisingly calm and immediately confessed to everything. Despite suddenly releasing Christy on one occasion, he had never let go of his desire for revenge, and in prison, he started plotting her murder. Knowing that he needed to escape from prison to carry out his plan, he feigned remorse by writing a sympathetic letter to the judge. While free, he didn't waste any time and waited, knowing that Christy and her family would be protected by the police. Although the judge believed that Chanda's family would keep an eye on him throughout the day, his mother worked long hours, and his sister was too young for such a role. She was scared of him herself. All his mother could do was keep kitchen knives away from him, but Chanda knew what she had in mind and hid one of them. On November 7th, he woke up at 6:30, knowing that the day had come. In 2 days, he was scheduled to appear in court, and Christie probably believed that she was safe. The investigators were confident that Akshay would be found guilty on all charges, since he had confessed to everything. However, they were surprised when he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Several experts, including one hired by his defense and 2 from the prosecution, evaluated him. Akshay told them that he had been hearing a persistent female voice for some time, especially in the mornings. He claimed that the voice ordered him to kill Christie and wished for her mother's death. Although initially Akshay could resist the voice's influence, he eventually succumbed to it. After consultations with psychiatrists and starting medication, he didn't express remorse for the murder but acknowledged that he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. It was incredibly difficult for Christie's parents to come to terms with the medical assessment. Tracy, in particular, struggled. She regretted opening the door to the killer and couldn't forget the last moments of Christie's life. "All I see, all I will ever see, is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping for air, covered in blood, dying for some senseless reason. He just stood there and watched. He didn't even attempt to escape. What kind of person does that?" She demanded punishment for Akshay, but the psychiatrist explained to her that Akshay's symptoms, previously attributed to depression, could now be explained by schizophrenia. Moreover, when depression is treated with medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can become more pronounced. During the first attack, the illness was in its early stage, and he managed to understand that harming the girl would be wrong, so he let her go. However, during the second incident, when he came for her, he was aware of what he was doing, but his illness prevented him from understanding that it was morally unacceptable. Akshay couldn't be tried for murder, but he was found guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. However, he would still serve his punishment in a psychiatric facility. He would only be released if he ceased to pose a danger to society, but his chances of recovery were extremely slim. The Marceau family relocated to Adelaide, Australia, but they didn't allow Christie's murder to become just another crime statistic. If Akshay had not been released on bail after the first crime, Christie would have moved to Australia and lived happily. Therefore, they started a campaign to change the bail laws. Thanks in part to their efforts, since 2013, defendants are required to prove that they are not a threat to society, instead of the police having to prove the opposite as it was before. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo? Bună ziua! Bună ziua! Vreau și în legătură cu poliția. Da. Ce s-a întâmplat? Doamnă, nu vă numiți. Sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn. Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheam Alexandra, vă rog veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal, cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Georga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Georga say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Georga Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Georga confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Louisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Louisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Louisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Louisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Louisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Louisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Louisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Louisa's grandfather, assuring him that Louisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Louisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the fourth day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Louisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Louisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Luisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louise's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Georga might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Georga, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Georga might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Georga's car was connected to Luisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Georga's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Georga hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Georga Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Georga had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Georga's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Georga once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz, and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past, an unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Tricia had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Tricia Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Tricia and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Tricia's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Tricia's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Tricia had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Tricia's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Tricia's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Tricia a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Tricia's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Tricia's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Tricia's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Tricia's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Tricia. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying, and when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Tricia's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Tricia's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Tricia's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer, but when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten, but by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and 1 set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Trisha Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Trisha's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Trisha's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Trisha's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Trisha's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Trisha was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Trisha's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Trisha's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Trisha's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Picaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Picaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. A tangled love story unfolds like a dark detective tale, a crime film, a film noir, with a timeless plot where lust and obsession lead to murder and classic betrayal. This was Jaime's favorite genre, and he played the lead villain. Patricia helped dress him in the costume of a deranged, jealous man, work overalls, gloves, and a stocking mask. Then she, the true star of this film, brilliantly played the victim. Thirsting for authenticity, she cut her own hand and barricaded herself in the bathroom, clutching a real revolver in her bleeding hand to complete the authenticity of her fabricated image. All that was missing was a camera to focus on her wild eyes and feigned horror as she aimed the revolver and fired. On June 25, 2008, at 1:15 a.m., while the residents of Garden Valley, California were peacefully sleeping in their beds, the fire station received a report of a fire blazing along a winding road above a deep gorge. This is a challenging area with many sharp turns, hills, and ravines. Only upon getting closer did the firefighters notice that a burning SUV was at the center of the fire. Their experience told them that the body of the driver might be inside. Unfortunately, they were right. The body, like the entire vehicle, was completely engulfed in flames. Earlier that evening, a report had been made to the emergency services about a missing resident who had gone to buy propane in his Chevrolet Suburban and had not returned. The firefighters could see that the vehicle burning before them was indeed a Suburban. The missing man was 54-year-old Ron Presba. Around 9 p.m., he had left to buy propane for a barbecue and never returned. The remains found at the scene were sent for an autopsy, but officers were able to identify the burned vehicle, and it was indeed Ron's SUV. The news quickly spread throughout Garden Valley. Many people knew Ron personally and were saddened by the news. Initially, everything pointed to the man being the victim of a road accident. On such a rough road, there were many opportunities for a vehicle to go off into the ravine and catch fire. The propane Ron was carrying only added fuel to the blaze. Firefighters found 2 large pools of blood, each more than a meter in diameter, on the road. They speculated that the man had hit a deer, a large animal that could cause such a significant amount of blood. It was hard to imagine a worse place to encounter an animal, a dark, winding road above a deep ravine without any guardrails or barriers. Many people in such situations react by sharply turning the wheels. However, the firefighters could not find the body of the struck animal near the collision site. Moreover, upon closer inspection, the bloodstains looked strange. Between the larger pools of blood were smaller bloodstains, as if something was bleeding, then stopped, then started bleeding again. Nearby, there was a partial footprint and some sort of stain, as if a package or something similar had been lying there. Additionally, there were acceleration marks near the scene, indicating that someone had left the scene in a vehicle, and quickly. Considering these strange findings on the road, the fire investigator suspected that this was not an accident. The suspicions of the fire investigator were confirmed when he found a bag with a reddish liquid near the burned-out vehicle. At first, he mistook it for transmission fluid, but it was strangely covered in flies. Upon closer examination, to his horror, he realized that the bag contained hair, skull fragments, and brain matter. The bag had traces of fire, although the flames hadn't yet reached it. This meant that Ron's vehicle had been set on fire before it went off the ravine. It was likely stopped, set ablaze, and then pushed down the slope. The bag was thrown afterward. This was clearly done intentionally. At the coroner's office, it was confirmed that the victim was Ron Presba. The blood on the road and in the bag also belonged to him. Ron had been murdered, and the fire was used to cover up the crime. Police investigators began their work, and the morning after the body was discovered, they spoke with the victim's wife, Patricia, or Patty. Patty seemed overwhelmed with grief, but was eager to help the police. She said that Ron had no enemies. In fact, someone like him couldn't have had enemies. He was one of the pillars of the Garden Valley community. Everyone saw him as a loving father, devoted husband, very honest, hardworking, reliable, and an all-around wonderful person. Ron would give you the shirt off his back to help someone. He had spent many years building his trucking company before he met Patty. Patty worked for the California Conservation Corps and was part of a program that taught young people who would otherwise get into trouble with the law useful labor skills in firefighting, forest protection, and conservation. It was essentially a work camp for troubled youth. Both Patty and Ron had adult children from previous relationships. The day before, at 4:30 p.m., Patty had gone to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived an hour away. She called her husband around 9 p.m., and he mentioned that he was going to get propane for the barbecue. However, when she returned at midnight, the house was empty. Ron's daughters told the police that a guest had been staying with the family in recent weeks. This guest was 21-year-old Jaime Ramos. Detectives returned to the family home to speak with Patty again. She confirmed that Jaime Ramos had been living with the family for 3 weeks. He was one of the troubled young people assisted by the California Conservation Corps, and Patty had been his mentor. Jaime Ramos had joined the program a year ago after being charged with assault. Patty and Ron decided to help the young man save money so he could visit his relatives in Texas. Patty described Jaime as a nice guy who had faced many challenges since childhood. His mother had taken her own life when he was just 2 years old. His father was in and out of his life, and after being passed around by various relatives, he eventually went to live with his grandmother, who became like a mother to him. Now Patty had taken on the role of his mentor and friend, and Jaime often sought her advice. She explained that Jaime was finishing his training program at the center, but needed a place to stay for the remaining month. Patty had asked Ron if Jaime could stay in their spare bedroom, and Ron, being a kind-hearted person, agreed. Ron welcomed Jaime into their home, and they developed a strong bond, with Ron becoming like a father figure to Jaime. However, just the day before, Jaime had left. They had lent him some money so he could travel to his relatives in Texas. Jaime's sudden departure seemed suspicious, especially since Patty claimed she didn't know how to contact him. In other words, they had lent the young man money, but she had no way to reach him. Before the detectives could ask Patty further questions, something caught their eye. A few drops of blood by the fireplace caught the detectives' attention. Although there weren't many, they deemed it important and called in the forensic team. Upon their arrival, they processed the room with luminol, causing it to light up with traces of blood that someone had attempted to clean. The detectives realized they had stumbled upon the murder scene. Since Patty had an alibi, Jaime seemed the most likely suspect. However, according to Patty, she and Ron had a good relationship with Jaime. Nevertheless, the detectives reached out to Jaime's family in Texas, who said he was still en route but provided his phone number. Over the phone, Jaime confirmed that Ron had become a true friend and mentor to him in a short period. He expressed his desire to help the police uncover the truth about Ron's death. Strangely, though, he refused to disclose his whereabouts. Since Jaime was using a prepaid phone, the police couldn't trace his location. Instead, they tried to gain his trust, encouraging Jaime to keep calling them and persuade him to reveal what he knew about Ron's death. Meanwhile, Curtis Edwards reached out to them. Curtis was also a member of the program helping young people, just like Jaime. Moreover, Jaime was his roommate. Therefore, he knew something that, in his opinion, no one else suspected. Jaime and Patty were having a romance. Curtis was shocked. All the young people in the organization loved Patty, calling her Mom, but Jaime clearly had feelings for her of a different nature. Despite being 21 years old, while she was 47, he was younger than her children. Nonetheless, Jaime asked Curtis not to tell anyone about it. As his friend, Curtis agreed, but now he felt obligated to inform the police. The meeting with the detectives was brief, but its importance for the investigation couldn't be underestimated. Because now the investigators knew that Jaime could have a motive for Ron's murder, it was worth talking to Patty again, because it became clear that she knew more than she was saying. Patty reluctantly admitted that she had been involved with Jaime, but a couple of days before Ron's murder, she ended things with her lover because his behavior was increasingly alarming her. When she brought up the breakup, they were in the car, and Jaime swerved the car as if he wanted to crash into an oncoming vehicle. Fortunately, they avoided the accident, but Patty realized he was willing to do anything just to be with her. At some point, Ron realized that his wife was having an affair, but he reacted as a very understanding person. Ron and Patty agreed to buy Jaime a car so he could go to Texas and stop being part of their lives. Patty and Jaime went to a car dealership to choose a car. Patty told the detectives that they bought the car, packed his things into it, and sent him off to Texas. And this happened just before Ron's murder. Now, however, she was afraid that Jaime would come back to finish what he started, to kill her. However, after reviewing the surveillance camera footage at the dealership, detectives found out that the love affair hadn't ended because Patty and Jaime were holding hands and hugging each other affectionately. But before the investigators could summon the woman for a candid conversation, a new twist emerged in the case. Patty disappeared. A month to the day after Ron's murder, the detectives drove back to the same house. Again, they approached the front door, crossed the threshold once more. The feeling of déjà vu never left them, especially when they saw that the small house had become the scene of another bloody crime. Blood was everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, even on the doorstep. Chairs were overturned, rugs were displaced as if something had been dragged across the floor. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the TV stand. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the bathroom door was broken with bullet holes in it. Everything seemed unreal, like a stage set. Amidst this gruesome scene, the detectives found a note made from cut-out magazine letters. They had never seen such notes before, except in movies. It stated that Patty had been kidnapped. Exactly what Patty had feared Jaime would do. The police began their search for the woman and distributed her description to officers. The next day, July 25, 2008, hundreds of kilometers away from the Prespa family home in Salt Lake City, Utah, a patrol officer was checking the registration numbers of cars in a motel parking lot when he noticed a green Hyundai. A quick check revealed that the car was linked to a murder investigation. The officer contacted detectives from California who informed him that two people were associated with this car, Jaime Ramos and Patricia Prespa. Approximately 5 minutes later, the door of the motel room opened and a woman came out. She walked straight to the police officer. He aimed his weapon at her, but the woman stated that she was Patricia Prespa, and she added, "He's in the room, he's been shot." The policeman didn't know what to think and couldn't imagine what he would see when he entered that door. He and his partner burst open the door and shouted, "Police!" But there was no response. Someone was clearly lying on the bed. The policeman demanded that the person raise their hands and come out, but the person didn't move. The officer thought the person under the blanket was dead. He grabbed the blanket and saw that there was a wounded person there. It was Jaime Ramos. He looked at the policeman and said, raising his hands, "Don't shoot. They've already shot me." Both Patricia and Jaime were taken into custody. While Jaime received medical attention, detectives questioned Patricia. Patty claimed that she also became a victim of Jaime. She recounted that she was sleeping in her bed when suddenly she was grabbed by a man wearing a mask made from a stocking, gloves, and a jumpsuit. She managed to break free, but he lunged at her again. They struggled, wreaking havoc around them. It was only when he dragged her into the kitchen that she realized it was Jaime, although she had never seen him like that before. He confessed to her that he had killed her husband, and she would be next. At one point, Jaime attempted to strike her with a large kitchen knife, slashing her hand as she tried to shield herself. However, she managed to reach the bedroom, grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver, and locked herself in the bathroom. Jaime smashed the door, and that's when she fired 3 times. Dropping the weapon, she ran outside, but even after she shot him 3 times with the Magnum, Jaime caught up with her and seized her. Now he had the gun, and he ordered her to get into his car. They stopped several times along the way, notably to refuel. Detectives puzzled over why she didn't escape from the wounded man while he was refueling the car. Patty replied that she was terrified. What happened next was known to the police. Here, the story could have ended, and Patty would have appeared a heroine if Jaime had died from the gunshot wounds. He was indeed close to death when they found him in the hotel, but he received timely medical attention and he was ready to talk to the police. When at the age of 21, Jaime was admitted to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he was given a job, he felt like he had hit the jackpot. He quickly befriended other members of the organization, particularly his roommate Curtis. as well as his supervisor, Patty. Initially, he regarded her as a friend and mentor, but soon their relationship became much closer. She didn't immediately confess to Jaime that she was married. Even more so, she didn't tell him how 6 years ago she had to work hard to make Ron fall in love with her when her third husband left her. But she told him that she was living in an unhappy marriage. Jaime's heartstrings were deeply touched by Patty's confessions. The thing was, he himself had been tormented by a male relative for years. It started when he was 6. It started when he was 6 years old, ended at 16, and occurred once or twice a month. Jaime asked Patty to leave her husband, but she always found some excuse why it was impossible. Then she mentioned another option. At first it was like a game, a joke. The woman said, "Do you want me to leave him? What if something unfortunate happens to him? Which we arrange?" Jaime asked incredulously. What else? Patty initiated conversations about how Ron liked to work around the house and might fall from a ladder onto something sharp or get hit by a car. It seemed like a joke until she showed her lover an envelope with insurance. And then he realized that everything they talked about was serious. She convinced him that after receiving the money, they could start over. Jaime would go to college first and they would live together. She took out insurance on her husband and was supposed to receive $150,000 in case of his death. But if his death occurred as a result of an accident, the wife would receive $300,000. This is called double insurance. Double insurance is also the name of a true classic of cinema, a film in which a woman seduces a man and persuades him to kill her husband. And then the seductress shoots the naive lover. Jaime hadn't watched that movie, but Patty clearly understood its essence. Or Oscar Wilde was right, and life ultimately does imitate art. But Jaime had no intention of becoming a murderer, and Patty started pressing him. "Don't you believe me? Don't you believe that he's tormenting me, beating me? Don't you want to live with me?" She didn't leave the man infatuated with her any other choice. So he set her a condition. He had to personally see what Ron was really like. The woman agreed. She told her husband that a guy at work insulted her, but Jaime stood up for her, beat him, and therefore he was expelled from the program. Now he had nowhere to live. Ron, being a kind soul, of course, offered the guy to stay with them. He personally went for Jaime, brought him home, and thanked him for standing up for his wife. He said that Jaime could live with them for free and only asked him to help around the house, because what the guy did for him was already enough payment. So Jaime started living with his mistress and her husband. Ron behaved friendly, taught him how to use various tools, and in general treated the guy like a son. But Jaime was most concerned that Ron never raised his voice to his wife, never scolded her, never refused her anything, and it clearly wasn't a show for the public. Doubts began to creep into his mind. Patty described a monster, but Jaime saw a completely different Ron. However, Patty wasn't about to back down. She skillfully manipulated the guy, convincing him that he was saving her from a cruel husband, and set a date for when Jaime would have to attack Ron. Otherwise, he would have to leave and never see her again. The thought of this was unbearable for Jaime. Tuesday, June 24th came, one of the longest days of the year. That evening, Ron sat calmly in his armchair by the fireplace watching TV. Patty had indeed gone to her daughters, but she kept calling her lover, asking if he had finished with her husband yet and why he was taking so long. She insisted that it would be easier to cover up the evidence if it happened outside, so Jaime told Ron that he heard some noise in the pen with his pigs. Ron, of course, believed him and went to check, but Jaime couldn't bring himself to attack the man. When Ron returned home, he sat back in his favorite armchair. Jaime sat on a chair in the kitchen 3 meters away from him and drank a lot of water, as if delaying what he was about to do, trying to calm down. Patty continued to call, asking when everything would be over. Jaime saw the hammer and decided that if one blow to the head rendered Ron unconscious, it would be enough for him. He took one last sip of water, put on gloves, wiped the hammer. The house was so small. Ron was so close. Jaime told himself, "You're doing everything right." He thought about the violence against Patty, remembered how he himself had been abused, and the anger from the flooding memories allowed him to feel a sharp adrenaline rush. He literally jumped up from the chair, ran to Ron, and struck the man 3 times quickly on the head. Ron barely had time to scream, "Why?" But Jaime seemed to snap. He shouted, "How dare you torment my wife? Yes, Patty is my wife now. How dare you hit her?" He struck the man 3 more times, smashing his skull. Then he dropped the hammer. Amazingly, he felt relieved, knowing that he did it for her. But to do everything as she wanted, the killer had to take the body out of the house and create the appearance of an accident. To put Ron in the driver's seat, he had to build a mini-trap from the ladder and plywood. After that, Jaime sat next to the deceased and directed the car towards the cliff, sitting next to the bloodied man whose head he had just smashed. To distract himself from such a reality, he remembered the movie Sin City. There's a scene where a killer drives down a deserted road with a corpse sitting next to him. But when Jaime watched that movie 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined he would do something similar. On the way, he threw away Ron's chair, the bloodied carpet, and the hammer. Then at the canyon, he used all the props to prepare the final scene of the accident. He doused the car with gasoline, prepared a propane tank, put the man's foot on the gas pedal, flicked his lighter. It was at that moment that the blood flowing from the car spilled onto the road and created a puddle. Jaime set fire to the SUV and rolled the car down. He noticed a packet. Cleaning up at home, he collected pieces of brain in a packet, and now it fell out of the car. Jaime threw it into the ditch, thinking the fire would destroy it. Then he ran to his car, waiting for him at the cliff, and wanted to drive to Texas, but he couldn't. He had to see her. When he entered the house, Patty was washing her husband's blood in the living room. And right where Ron had been killed a few hours earlier, Patty's 3-year-old granddaughter sat watching cartoons on TV. Patty flew into a rage when she saw him. Jaime asked to hug him goodbye. Patty reluctantly complied, and he finally left. On the way, alone with his thoughts, he began to realize what he had done. He felt very ashamed and sick. Jaime was supposed to go to Texas to be with his relatives, but when the police didn't believe in the accident and began investigating the murder, Patty became nervous. She ordered him to go somewhere they wouldn't find him. Her anxiety multiplied when a month later, Jaime told her he was returning to California. The investigators had traced him back to his grandmother, the woman who raised him and whom he obeyed unquestioningly. She told her grandson that he shouldn't behave as if he were guilty of something and returned to California to talk to the police. Jaime agreed, but on his way back, despite his grandmother's and the investigators' advice, he called Patty. Apparently, that's when Patty realized that he was becoming a problem, and it was time to abandon him to save herself. She listened to Jaime and replied that she had a plan that would allow them to spend the rest of their lives together. Wasn't this what he had always dreamed of? She wanted to make it seem as if Jaime had abducted her. He agreed, thinking they would leave together and lie low for a while. Patty ordered her lover to overturn all the furniture in her house and knock down the bathroom door to make the abduction look more realistic. But she didn't warn him that she would be hiding behind it with a magnum. And as soon as he broke the door, she shot. Once, twice, thrice. She hit his hand, leg, and clavicle area. Jaime was in shock, asking, "How could you do this?" The woman calmly approached and pressed the gun to his head, but the gun didn't fire. While Jaime lay on the floor in blood, she went to another room, tried to fix the gun, but changed her mind and left. For some reason, Jaime decided to follow her. Even more unbelievably, Patty said to him, "Okay, let's go." And they left the state together. The next day, Jaime's car was spotted at a motel in Salt Lake City, and the couple was taken into custody. But Patty wasn't done yet. She still had one last hope, to convince Jaime to take the blame. But how could she do that? Before the trial, Patty and Jaime were held in a small jail together, and the plumbing arrangement of the prison allowed Patty to once again get into the heart and soul of her young lover. If you simultaneously flush the water in the female and male toilets, you can talk as if you are in the same room. Most likely, Patty wasn't the first to discover this, but she cleverly took advantage of this peculiarity, persuading Jaime to stick to her version. Allegedly, at first, she also wished for her husband's death, but changed her mind, and then Jaime killed Ron and abducted her, trying to get rid of the only witness. Remarkably, Jaime was willing to go along with this for her sake. However, when the boy's lawyer learned about it, he intervened and shuffled the cards for Patty. He contacted the only person who could break the spell over the woman, Jaime's grandmother. The grandmother and the beloved aunts of the young man ordered him to tell the whole truth. In the interrogation room, the investigators witnessed the power Patty had over Jaime. Despite her confession and everything she had done, Jaime begged for the opportunity to see her. In June 2009, the preliminary hearing began. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Jaime was not the only one whom Patty had tried to persuade to commit murder. Her friend took the witness stand and told that Patty had asked her if she knew anyone who could go for this crime. But even stranger was that she once wanted to kill her ex-husband, and then asked the ex-husband if he would kill Ron. On June 29, 2009, Jaime pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patty. But he did not get such an opportunity. Just a couple of days before the start of the trial in February 2010, she also admitted guilt. She was sentenced to imprisonment from 42 years to life for Ron's murder and attempted murder of Jaime. Jaime was sentenced from 25 years to life. Just before starting his sentence, Jaime met with Ron's 2 daughters and told them that he was a wonderful person. He treated him kindly, and Jaime also managed to love him for the short time he knew him. Yet despite what his own eyes had seen, Jaime chose to believe Patty. She chose an impressionable, vulnerable boy who was not loved in childhood, got into his soul, and made him do what she needed.